Welcome to my channel and to tonight's Death Row Dinners video, where I will be eating the last meal of somebody who has been on death row and then telling you how they ended up there. For his last meal, Joseph Arridy chose to have ice cream, and I thought it would be nice to try a Scottish brand. Now, I got this from Asda, and I don't know if you can see how caked in ice the tub is. But it has been out and it has been softening, and this is Equi's honeycomb. I do like Equi's ice cream. It's got a lovely creaminess to it, and the honeycomb flavour is sweet but not too much. I'm sure this is not the flavour that he had, but it's the one I'm having. And in last year's Death Row Dinners, which if you haven't seen, there'll be a link to the playlist at the end of this video. You can check it out. Somebody did have ice cream, and I wanted to make sure that I had something different this year to what I had last year. You can actually see the bits of honeycomb and the swirl. This is going to make such a mess as the ice melts. That's on Asda, not on Equi's or me. So another version of me is going to tell you all about the case. Tonight's case is a very sad one, and a reminder that not everyone who is convicted and then executed on death row is guilty of the crime for which they have been put there. Joe Arridy has often been referred to as the happiest man on death row, and he is as much a victim in this case as those who were attacked in the crime which ultimately led to his conviction. Joseph Arridy was born on April 29th, 1915 in Pueblo, Colorado. He was the first child born to Mary and Henry Arridy, immigrants from Berocia on Mount Lebanon, Syria. They had left their impoverished existence and come to America in the hopes of forging a better life. Neither of them spoke any English, but both managed to secure jobs in a steel mill in Colorado. They were first cousins, and it has been speculated that this may have contributed to some of the mental difficulties Joe experienced in his life. Indeed, several of his siblings died in early childhood, and one of his younger brothers also suffered from impaired mental functioning. Joe was 5 years old before his speech developed, and he entered the public school system in 1921 at the age of 6. He remained a pupil at Bessemer Elementary School for 1 year. Soon after he began his second year there, the principal made the decision that he needed to be removed from the school as he was incapable of learning and should therefore be kept at home. Joe spent the next 4 years at home. He was a shy but good-natured child, somewhat of a loner. He preferred to play by himself rather than with other children, no doubt because he was a target for bullying. Neighbours of the Arridy family considered him to be something of an outsider. He spent much of his time making mud pies, hammering nails, and just wandering around the neighbourhood. He rarely spoke. In 1925, Henry Arridy lost his job at the mill. Joe was now 10 years old, and Henry was desperate to find a way of helping his son. His neighbours wrote letters for him on his behalf, seeking aid from the Pueblo County Court. On October 30th, the court ordered Joe's commitment to the Colorado State Home and Training School for Mental Defectives, an institution 280 miles away in Grand Junction on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains. Upon his arrival at this institution, Joe underwent a battery of tests. He was examined by L. Hopkirk using the 1916 Stanford revision of the Binet-Simon psychological battery of tests. This was created in 1905 and consisted of 30 tests, gradually increasing in complexity and covering things such as memory, psychological reasoning, and judgment. Hopkirk observed that Joe usually spoke in sentences that were only 2 or 3 words long. An extremely shy and passive child, Joe was unable to repeat back 4 digits or to correctly identify colours or objects. He couldn't recite the days of the week and responded only to the examiner. He made no attempt to initiate any sort of discourse. He also had an inability to think about anything abstractly and had very black and white thinking. Hopkins declared him to be, and I quote, an imbecile with an IQ of only 48. Other members of the Arridy family were also tested. Mary was diagnosed as feeble-minded, and George, his younger brother, a high moron. By August 13th, 1926, Joe had been living away from home for 10 months. His father was feeling guilty for having sent him away and again enlisted the help of neighbours to write formal letters to the institution to ask that Joe be allowed to return home. The superintendent of said institution drafted up a letter that exonerated them of any responsibility for Joe. Henry signed this and was able to take his son home. Joe spent the next few years exactly as he had done before he'd been sent away. Whilst he remained painfully shy and withdrawn and was never known to bother anyone, others were happy to corner and bother him, picking on him. He was taunted and beaten by his peers. The next part was very difficult for me to read about, and it makes me feel very angry. On September 17th, 1929, when Joe was 13 years old, he was arrested by a police probation officer. The officer came across a group of older teenagers forcing Joe to perform sexual acts and made the decision to arrest the victim. He also contacted the superintendent of the Colorado State Institution, making his feelings clear. Joe should never have been permitted to leave and return to Pueblo. As a result of this, Joe was readmitted and spent the next 7 years there. There were no repercussions for the group of older teenagers. Joe spent most of his time back at the institution in the day room, records showing that he was unable to participate in any schooling or farming, one of the other activities available for clients. He was, however, able to lend a hand in the kitchens and became particularly close to Mrs. Bowers, who worked there. She recalled that he was able to do simple tasks that did not take too long, such as washing dishes, mopping the floors, or easy errands and chores. She observed that he was reliant on others to provide him with instruction and direction. The superintendent, Dr. Benjamin Jefferson, later testified that Joe never showed any interest in girls whilst he was there. He also mentioned that Joe was often taken advantage of by other boys staying there. In one example, they persuaded Joe to confess to having stolen some cigarettes, despite the fact it was impossible for him to have done so. On Saturday, August 4th, 1936, America was experiencing the Great Depression, which saw many people out of work. The boys in the institution often saw men riding on the tops of freight train boxcars and wanted to try it for themselves. Joe was no exception. On the night of the 8th, he left with a fellow kitchen worker after they were finished, walking off the grounds. The pair were gone all night. On the Sunday, Joe's companion boarded a train taking him to Salt Lake City, but Joe wandered off on his own. Later that day, he was joined by 3 more residents, and the 4 of them slept in a boxcar that night. On the morning of Monday, 10th August, all 4 boarded a freight train heading through the Rocky Mountains to the east. On Tuesday, it pulled into Pueblo, and Joe wandered away from his companions. Later that evening, the 3 young men found Joe still in the railway yard, and all 4 hopped onto a train heading back to Grand Junction. When they arrived on the Wednesday and disembarked, Joe again wandered off from the group. One man from the home did report seeing Joe in the rail yards on the evening of Thursday 10th, after which there is no record of his whereabouts for the next 7 days. Joe resurfaced again on August 20th at about 2:30 p.m. in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He approached the kitchen car of a Union Pacific train, wanting to work in exchange for food. He was both dirty and hungry. Mr. and Mrs. Gibson, who supervised the kitchen car, cleaned him up, washed his clothes, gave him a fresh shirt and set him to work washing dishes. Eventually, the crew moved to Archer, which was 9 miles east of Cheyenne. Joe went along with them. The Gibsons noticed that he said very little and never initiated a conversation, but appreciated his value as a voluntary dishwasher. On August 26th, the kitchen crew were scheduled to move once more. Since Joe was not actually a paid employee, he was unable to go with them this time. Mrs. Gibson drove him back to the Cheyenne rail yard and dropped him off there. Later that day, he was arrested in the yards and charged with vagrancy by railroad detectives George Burnett and Carl Christiansen. He was taken by them to the Laramie County Jail in Cheyenne. We now jump back slightly to August 15th, 1936. This was during the period where the whereabouts of Joe Arridy were unknown. The Drain family lived in a house in Pueblo. Parents Riley and Minnie Drain had been out for the evening, leaving their daughters, 15-year-old Dorothy and 12-year-old Barbara, at home. The two sisters had fallen asleep in the same bed. When their parents returned home, they discovered Dorothy lying dead in a pool of her own blood, and Barbara also severely injured, barely alive. Both girls had sustained blows to the head, and Dorothy had also been raped. Barbara, however, had not been sexually assaulted. The item used to deliver the blows to the girls was later identified to be a hatchet, and the attack had taken place shortly before midnight. Understandably, this attack left the community in shock, and newspapers published sensationalist stories about a sex-crazed murderer running about. This put immense pressure on the police to solve the case and apprehend the killer. When 21-year-old Joe was arrested for vagrancy, a man named Frank Aguilar was already being held. Authorities knew from his records that Joe had a history of indecent liberties and had recently absconded from a home for those who were considered to be mentally impaired. His Syrian parentage gave him a darker complexion, which could be considered a match to the Mexican described in the attack. Sheriff George Carroll was on duty that night, and he claimed that he was able to obtain a confession from Joe that evening. He called to relay the news to the Pueblo police chief, J. Arthur Grady, and also the press. The next morning, front covers were emblazoned with the story that Joe Arridy had attacked the two girls and bludgeoned them with a club. It is worth noting that Carroll never actually produced a written version of Joe's statement and is reported to have asked him many leading questions. Chief Grady was caught off guard by this confession. The Mexican man already in custody, Frank Aguilar, was suspected of the crime, and a hatchet head believed to be the weapon had been found in his home. He was, however, refusing to confess. Carroll later testified that a total of 5 telephone calls took place between himself and the police chief over the course of that night. On August 27th, the following day, Carroll again contacted the press to correct a couple of things in the original statement he had given them. 2 detectives had been sent from Pueblo to Cheyenne to be present during the interrogation of Joe. Carroll informed the press that, subsequent to further questioning, Joe had revealed that it was a hatchet he used rather than a club, and that he had committed the crime in cooperation with Aguilar. It is incredible that a man who could not differentiate colours correctly could recall this level of detail. The actual confession was 2 short statements, "with Frank" and "that's Frank." This was all the evidence connecting the 2 men and Joe to the crime. Carroll brought Aguilar into the room and asked Joe who it was. When Joe said, "That's Frank," Aguilar retorted that he'd never seen Joe in his life. I believe, as do many, that Joe was told what to say by Carroll. When asked why he had participated in the murder, Joe reportedly said, "Just for meanness, and I'm sorry now. If they will just let me alone, I'll be good after this." An incredible feat for a man who usually spoke in sentences of only 1 or 2 words in response to anything. Joe's story repeatedly changed, depending on who was questioning him and what he was asked. Once the questioning was over, Carol contacted the Cheyenne police chief, Joe Cahill. The two men transported Joe Arridy to the Pueblo Police Department and then on to the Colorado State Hospital to keep him safe overnight. Also on the 28th, a local pawnbroker named Saul Kahn came into the police station. He was the owner of Kahn's Loan Company, and he attested that Joe had purchased a pistol from him on Friday, 14th August. If this purchase actually took place, the pistol was never recovered. Residents of the facility where Joe had been staying were not permitted to have any money, so there is also a query over how he would have been able to obtain the funds to make this purchase in the first place. On August 23rd, a woman named Helen O'Driscoll had been attacked. She was shown a picture of Joe by Chief Hugh Harper, and she positively identified him as her attacker. Harper released this information to the press, and he accompanied Helen to the prison where Joe was being held to make a face-to-face identification. This created a very awkward situation when it became apparent that Joe could not have committed this offence. In the day in question, he was working for the Gibsons washing dishes. It was on September 2nd that Aguilar finally gave a confession, after 5 days of constant interrogation, which was transcribed and published fully in the Pueblo Chieftain newspaper over the following days. Aguilar then recanted this statement, saying that Warden Best had come to his cell that morning and advised him that bad things would start happening if he did not talk. Joe was purportedly present at Aguilar's transcribed interrogation, and District Attorney French Taylor stated that Joe was highly verbal and focused throughout. Once again, quite spectacular, considering the sheer amount of evidence to demonstrate that Joe was capable of being neither of these things. The transcripts show only 6 questions about Joe, all of which were directed to Aguilar, despite the fact that Joe was apparently in the room. Aguilar signed his statement with an X, and this was followed by the signatures of 6 witnesses. Joe, who had never been to school and learned how to read and write, managed to sign A-R-R-D-Y in small letters, and no witness signatures followed this. This transcript was deemed to suffice as confessions for both men, something which was never brought up by Joe's defence during his trial. Both men ended up being charged with the murders. Aguilar was the first to stand trial. During this, Riley Drain, the father of the 2 girls, testified that he and his younger daughter, Barbara, had visited Frank Aguilar in prison on November 27th. Both D.A. Taylor and Warden Best were present during this. Riley Drain knew Aguilar because he was working on a WPA project that was supervised by Drain and taking place in front of the Drain home. Aguilar therefore knew both Dorothy and Barbara. Riley testified that Aguilar told him how he had been on Northern Avenue heading to a show when he changed his mind about going and chose to go and buy alcohol instead. He claimed that this made him drunk and he went home to lie down. A bit later, a man who Aguilar owed some money to showed up, and the 2 men returned to Northern Avenue, which was where Aguilar met with Joe Arridy. Aguilar and Joe went back to Aguilar's home to fetch a hatchet, and he then described what was done to the 2 girls. Once again, Aguilar then recanted this, reasserting that Warden Best had come to his cell and told him there would be a dead Mexican if he didn't confess. A toxicologist named Dr. Frances McConnell also testified at Aguilar's trial. She worked with Denver hospitals studying hay fever and the common cold, and she had been sent a sample of hairs collected from the crime scene of the Drain girls. This was hand-delivered to her office at 4 p.m. on August 26th, the same evening on which Carol began his interrogation of Joe. On August 31st, a second envelope arrived via registered post. This contained hairs obtained from Joe's head and chest. Frances McConnell testified that one hair from the crime scene evidence was a match to Joe Arridy. She stated it belonged to a person of American Indian heritage. This single hair was the only physical piece of evidence linking Joe to the crime. The method used at that time to process and match hairs has since been discredited, but at the time, along with the two-word statements from Joe, this was enough to satisfy the authorities that Joe Arridy had been involved. On December 1st, 1936, Barbara Drain was brought in to testify at Aguilar's trial. She had originally been given a 50-50 chance of survival, but had managed to pull through. When asked to identify the man who had attacked her and her sister, Dorothy, she stepped down from the witness stand, went to stand in front of Aguilar, and clearly and firmly stated that he was the man. She never identified Joe, and, indeed, was never called to give testimony at his trial. In fact, she did not attend it at all. On December 22nd, the final day of his trial, Frank Aguilar changed his plea from not guilty to guilty by reason of insanity, but this motion was rejected. Aguilar was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Dorothy Drain. After this sentence was passed, Aguilar was found guilty of committing another crime which took place only 3 blocks away from the Drain home. On August 2nd, 1936, a lone Mexican man broke into a home where 72-year-old Sally Crumpley and 48-year-old Mrs. R.O. McMurtry were staying. Both women were asleep in the same bed and bludgeoned in the head by the attacker. Sadly, Sally died from her injuries, but Mrs. McMurtry survived. When she saw Aguilar face to face, she was immediately able to identify him as the man responsible for the attack on her and Sally. A man who acted alone in this crime. Police failed to link this case with that of the Drain girls, only making the connection after Aguilar's trial, when it was too late to stop proceedings against Joe. With Aguilar convicted and sentenced, Joe Arridy's trial commenced on February the 8th, 1937, with a sanity trial as requested by his defence. The court had to decide whether Joe had the capacity to tell good from evil and right from wrong. If they made the decision that he did not, then he would be declared insane. 3 psychiatrists took the stand to give their professional opinions. All 3 concurred that in order to be declared insane, you had to have a normally functioning brain. Since Joe did not have a normally functioning brain, he therefore could not be insane. However, despite this, they all agreed he lacked the capacity to differentiate right from wrong. On February 9th, Joe took the stand for the one and only time, and this lasted for about an hour. It was a task to pry information from him due to his reticence to speak, but it was established that he didn't know what an oath was, who the clerk of the court was, or what he meant when he spoke to Joe asking him to swear before giving his testimony. Joe was also unable to say who Franklin D. Roosevelt and George Washington were. When asked by a prosecutor where his father was, Joe replied, "Home." The prosecutor pointed to Henry Arridy, who was sitting in the courtroom, and asked Joe if that was his father. Joe responded, "Uh-huh." The prosecutor then said that Joe's father wasn't at home then, and Joe responded with, "No." He also denied knowing Frank Aguilar. He also testified that he had no idea why the 3 psychiatrists present were talking about him, that he didn't know Dorothy Drain, and had no idea what a hatchet even was. On February 11th at 2:30 p.m, the jury went to deliberate. By 9 p.m, they had reached a deadlock, 6 jurors believing Joe to be insane, and 6 believing that he was not. 1 hour later, they returned their verdict, deeming him sane and fit to stand trial for the rape and murder of Dorothy Drain. It was on April 12, 1937, that Joe Arridy's trial for this crime began. His defence lawyer asked to use his time in court to once again present a case for insanity, and the judge agreed to this. He made it clear in his opening arguments that he would not be presenting an evidentiary case, that he would only cross-examine witnesses for the prosecution, and that he wanted the court to reconsider whether or not Joe was insane. Riley Drain was called by the prosecution to testify in the trial against Joe. He described the layout of his home in detail and his own activities on the night in question. He made no mention of ever having encountered Joe before. The key witness in this case against Joe was Sheriff Carroll, taking the stand on 5 separate occasions to give testimony. Court transcripts show that Carroll was allowed to speak at length with very little interjection or questioning from the prosecution. Carroll also had no notes or documents to refer to whilst giving his version of events. Other witness testimonies appear to largely echo Carroll's account rather than presenting anything new. A quote from Carroll about some information given to him during his interrogation of Joe reads as follows. He said there was a door in the room, a dresser in the room, a closet in the room, and he said there was some dresses hanging on the wall, but one was red and one was a blue dress. I asked him the colour of the nightgowns. He first said they were white, then later on he said that one of them was a kind of pink. It was not pure white. I don't know whether those answers were correct or not. I try my best to remain impartial whilst giving accounts of these cases, but I find it impossible to believe that a man who could not tell the difference between red and black, could not recall more than 4 numbers in a row, and could not tell you who the president was, could suddenly give such a detailed description of a bedroom he had been in once, and only briefly, and at night. Carroll also supervised a reenactment at the crime scene, and part of his description of this is as follows. Just as we come into the door, I asked him where he turned up the light. He reached over and up under the lampshade, and turned on the floor lamp light. Then we asked him to go over the same route that he did the night of the murder in the bedroom. He went directly through the parlour, through the kitchen into the hall, and to the left of the bedroom where the murder had occurred. When we got in there, I asked him to show me how he turned on the light in there. He walked up and turned on the globe light that hung from the ceiling. Dr. Frances McConnell was brought in to present her findings on the hair samples. She referred to the single hair as being from an American Indian. Joe was of Syrian descent. This fact seems to have been overlooked, or at least not considered to be important, in the conviction of Joe. Saul Khan, the pawnbroker, also gave evidence. In his earlier visit to the police station, he had stated that Joe purchased the gun from his shop on August 14th. In court, however, he stated the purchase had been made on August 15th. Joe had actually been spotted in Grand Junction on the 13th, and so would not have had time to purchase the gun on the 14th, as the freight train journey from Grand Junction to Pueblo took 24 hours, therefore making it impossible for Joe to have purchased the gun on the 14th. Joe's defence counsel said the following. Our testimony will show that this young man was incompetent, was so insane as to not know what he was doing, so insane as to not know what he was saying to the officers, that he could be led into saying anything people wanted him to say or admitting any crime he is charged with, and it will further show that when his purported confession or statement was taken from him by these officers, his mind is so weak, he is so insane that there is no question about voluntariness or involuntariness of the statement which George Carroll testified to. The 3 psychiatrists who had evaluated Joe during his sanity trial presented their evidence once more, led by Dr. Benjamin Jefferson, superintendent of the institution where Joe had been living. They reiterated that despite being unable to tell right from wrong, Joe was not insane. The defence called no experts of their own to give any testimony on their behalf. On April 17th, the verdict on Joe was returned. Guilty. He was sentenced to death. His purported co-conspirator, Frank Aguilar, was executed on 13th August 1937. During his detention on death row, Warden Best struck up a friendship with Joe. He gave Joe gifts such as a battery-operated car and a picture book. For his last Christmas, the warden gave Joe a toy train. Joe was known to run along the corridors playing with it and shouting, "Train wreck!" Other inmates also regarded him fondly. During this time, Warden Best was working with attorney Ken Ireland to try to get Joe's sentence overturned. He managed to get a total of 9 stays of execution for Joe over this time, but since it was now too late to put in an evidentiary defence, all that could be done was to put in pleas of insanity. Despite his best efforts, clemency was not granted. Before his execution, Joe gave his possessions away. He originally wanted to take his prized toy train with him, but was talked out of it, instead giving it to fellow inmate Angelo Agnes. But he requested that he be allowed to play with it until officials came to get him. He asked Warden Best to give his toy car to his nephew, Buddy. Joe's final meal was ice cream, made for him by Mabel Best, the warden's wife. On January 6, 1939, Warden Best walked with Joe to the gas chamber. He held Joe's hand while he was strapped into the chair. Joe was smiling the whole time, up until the black blindfold was placed over his eyes. At this time, he appeared to be confused about what was happening, but smiled again once Warden Best took his hand and reassured him. Joe was buried at the Greenwood Pioneer Cemetery in Cannon City, just 6 plots away from Frank Aguilar. It seems clear to me that Joe was manipulated, Sheriff Carroll taking full advantage of how easily led he was. Carroll seems to have been more concerned about his own professional appearance than the fact an obviously innocent man was being sent to his death. I feel anger towards the judge and jury who convicted and sentenced Joe on such tenuous evidence. There was no written statement or confession, and how anyone could genuinely believe that Joe was guilty of such a horrendous crime is beyond me. I am, of course, looking at this case through the lens of 2023, but even without the technological advancements in forensics we have today, I'm astounded that people were so convinced of Joe's guilt they could sentence him to death. Joe's story does not end here. Although he was now dead, many people believed an innocent man had been put to death. Awareness was brought to his case in 1992 after a poem entitled "The Clinic" was discovered slipped inside a copy of a book. It described a warden shedding tears over an inmate he was about to put to death. This inmate was identified shortly after as being Joe Arridy. A group named the Friends of Joe Arridy was formed. Among the members were several people from the legal profession, and they set to work petitioning the governor. Finally, in January 2010, their efforts paid off, and Joe Arridy was granted a posthumous pardon. His gravestone now contains the additional inscription, "Here lies an innocent man." Barbara Drain married and eventually died at the age of 78. I want to end this video by remembering the names of those innocents whose lives were stolen from them. 15-year-old Dorothy Drain, her whole life ahead of her, murdered as she slept. And Joe Arridy, a man in possession of a childlike innocence who was the victim of an atrocious miscarriage of justice. The warden wept before the lethal beans were dropped that night in the airless room. 50 faces appearing against glassed screens, a clinic crowd outside the tomb. In the corridor, a toy train pursued its tracks past countryside and painted station of tinny folk. The doomed man's eyes were glued on these. He was the tearless one, who waited, unknowing why the warden wept, and watched the toy train with the prisoner who watched the train, or ate, or simply slept. The warden wrote a sorry letter. The man you killed tonight is 6 years old. He has no idea why he dies. Yet he must die in the room the state has walled, transparent to its glassy eyes. And yet suppose no human is more than he, the highest good to which mankind attains, this dry-eyed child who watches joyously the shining speed of toy trains. What warden weeps in the stony corridor? What mournful eyes are peering through the glass? Who will ever shut a final door and watch the fume upon a face?